Hello, it's Dawn Michelle and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do a VR, a sort of VR, a mostly VR, to Maureen at Waves of Your Soul. She did this excellent video a couple weeks ago called My Top 5 Tarot and Oracle Decks halfway through the year. So halfway through 2024. So I don't think I have any Oracle though. I did just my top 5 tarot decks, kind of this mid-year check-in thing. That's another tag. I wouldn't mind getting around to that one too. But today I just want to talk about the top 5 decks. Like Maureen, I also have an honorable mention. Do I have 2 honorable mentions? Yes, I do. So technically it's like my top 5 with 2 honorable mentions. So did I shove 7 decks in here? I absolutely did. All right, let's talk about the first deck, which is probably my most used deck so far this year. And it's so funny because it's like, it's old school. It's old school deck. This is my Dreaming Way Tarot. And I think I've talked about this deck quite a bit recently. I am, really enjoying reconnecting with this deck. It's one that I've had a really long time in my collection. I really like the imagery and the artwork. It feels like it really relates to where I am currently in my life. And I think I've mentioned before, like, the Llewellyn, it was a deck, it was a tried and true favorite for a really long time. And if you'd asked me a couple years ago what my absolute favorite deck is, I probably would have told you the Llewellyn. Nowadays, because we grow and we change, I feel like the Dreaming Way more sits in alignment with who I am and how I'm currently like being in the world. And so it feels more in alignment with me and where I'm at in my life. I really like the art. It's very clean and kind of a little bit more on the minimalistic side, for an RWS deck. So like, with it being a very scenic deck, it is very clean, very minimal. I really like the color palette. I really like the use of the patterns in the art. I love that the cups have like different dots on them. It's a beautiful aesthetic representation of, I feel like, where I kind of am in my life. But also the thing that I really love about this deck and why it tends to just keep coming back into rotation for me is because of the way it reads. It's such a solid reader. I never struggle with what this deck is trying to tell me. It always gives me very clear, very spot on readings. And it just has this amazing ability to like be whatever it is I need it to be in the moment. So like if I had to pick one deck, I hate that question, but if I had to pick one deck, and that was the only deck I could use, it would probably be this one because it's such a clear reader. Aesthetically, it represents everything that I love and it represents me and my life really well right now, but also I can throw it at anything. And I absolutely love that it is that versatile for me. It's also mass market, it's readily available, affordable, all the good things. It's not my favorite in terms of cardstock. It's a little bit cardboardy, it's a little bit stiff and hard for me to shuffle. The backs are okay. Like I really don't feel they match the front of the deck very well, but those few things aside, like I can shuffle it. It's a little bit easier for me to overhand shuffle. It's definitely not my favorite deck in terms of cardstock, but it's my favorite deck to work with in terms of the imagery, in terms of the representation of the Rider-Waite-Smith, and in the way that I can just throw any sort of question, reading, use it for anything. And it just works so beautifully for that. So it's kind of like one of those tried and true all around decks that I can just consistently count on, and I know that it's always going to give me the message that I need in the moment. So that's the Dreaming Way Tarot, which is probably my #1 most used deck, although like I'm not actually ranking these in any sort of order. I'm just going to show them. But like if I had to pick one that I've used the most, probably this one so far this year. So the next deck is another one that probably won't be any surprise to anybody, and that is my Diablo Tarot. Again, also not my favorite deck in terms of cardstock and the way it shuffles or being able to handle it. It is very, very oversized. It's actually quite heavy and it's very difficult to work with. I have edged my copy. I think I showed it in a recent mod roundup video. I love this deck. There's just something about this deck. I've talked about this deck in multiple videos. I think I did a whole video dedicated to this deck, which I will leave linked in the description box below for you. This deck has really found a very special place in my practice and in the way that I work with it. I also mentioned it when I was talking about decks relating to different feeling states. Again, that's another video that I did, so I'll leave that for you linked below too. And while that is primarily how I use this deck, like the main thing that I use it for, like I pull it out all the time for all kinds of different things. Like if I want to know like what's going on underneath something, I'll pull this. I pull it out as the focus card in my light and shadow spread that I do when I use a plethora of decks and my dice. This deck always is kind of like the anchor, the focal point of the reading. It really has this ability to kind of show the underappreciated side of things, because while this artwork I think is absolutely stunning, it is depicting very grotesque things a lot of the time. And I love that, actually. I absolutely love that about this deck. It feels like it sits in a very unique space. I don't have any other decks that feel like they tap into this particular type of energy. And the way that I work with is really for like, as I've talked about many times before, like, man, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what I need. I'm feeling lost. I'm feeling hopeless. I'm feeling like I'm drowning, whatever the case may be. It really is a deck that I go to a lot when I'm in an ugly space, because this deck, while I think it is beautiful, does depict ugly things a lot of the time. Like there's ugly demons in here and like, you know, creepy looking creatures and things like that. But it really highlights that for me. And it helps me to find the beauty in it, which is just amazing. Like there's so much beauty in this card, in this deck, even though it's so grotesquely depicted in a lot of the cards. And I really love that about it. It's definitely one of my most used decks for the year. I have very specific things that I do with it, but I also just pull it out a lot of the time when I'm just feeling in this particular space or in this particular way. And it just always hits things spot on. I have mentioned before, it's got my favorite like lovers card of all time. Oh, look, perfect. I love when it does that. This card just always shows up whenever I'm like talking about it. And it's like, here I am, show me off, because this is the most gorgeous lovers card. I absolutely love it. In my opinion, you don't need to know the Diablo stories to work with this deck, but if you do know the stories, it's just like all the better. But this is basically Lilith, and this is basically an angel, and like I just love that idea for the lovers. So yeah, definitely one of my most used decks this year. Use it for all kinds of things, but again, like tactilely, it's not great. It's heavy, it's thick. I have to like shuffle it sideways, which thankfully the cardstock is thin enough that I can riffle shuffle it, but then I can't really bridge it back together. So I gotta kind of like, it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. This deck is kind of difficult physically to work with, but that actually kind of works with the energy of the deck. It's not about, you know, being the most beautiful, aesthetically pleasing thing there ever was, right? It's about embracing that. I totally messed up that shuffle. It's about embracing the messy, the ugly, the stuff that we don't want to necessarily always bring into the light, but we need to, right? So I think this deck, kind of the physical challenge of working with it is actually part of the whole experience. That's not normally something I would say in a good way, but for this particular deck, it works really, really well for me. So let's talk about another deck that I have used the heck out of this year. Also, it's difficult to work with in a physical sense. This is the Notoria Tarot and Light. Now I also have the Goetia. I did not pull that one out here because I was trying to keep like the main decks that I chose to the 5. I was trying to behave. Here's the backs of this. This is also a mass market deck. Dreaming Way and Diablo, both mass market. This deck is like, y'all know, it's AKA boyfriend deck. This is my Astarian deck, but it's also my light deck when I do my light and shadow readings, and I use the Goetia as the shadow energy. And so this deck for me is the one that I pull out for when I'm looking for that energy, that sort of light, angelic hope, finding my way through the darkness. this is the deck that I pull out for that. It's also the deck that I use when Lisa and I play Baldur's Gate 3, and we have a particular stream where we actually use cards in combat. So when it is Astarian's turn for combat, I use this deck to pull for his turn options. So basically whatever the card is, that is what he gets to do in his turn. I also have in my honorable mention is my deck that I use in that game for my character. So we'll talk about that when we get there. It's really cool to use these decks in these different ways in terms of tapping into the different energies, but also like using them for more than just readings, right? This deck serves a purpose in my practice in terms of light and shadow. I've also used it in terms of the actual angel work. So when I do angel and demon work, I pull out the Notoria and the Goetia together. It is a boyfriend deck, so I use it when I do boyfriend readings. I use it in game when I'm playing his character. And so it's just one of those that kind of slots into so many different areas in my life. And I'm completely attached to it. There's a full-on sentimental layer to this whole experience with this deck. It's really not one I would have picked out prior to any of this, like making this connection to a particular character, which led me to what that character's story is, which led me to what this deck eventually came to represent, which is the light, the hope. And that's what this deck has come to represent for me. And it works beautifully for that. I love the aesthetics of it too. I love the black and white with those really vivid pops of yellow and the red. It just feels very rich and opulent. But it also feels like it sits very much in that hopeful space of like, even when things are going rough, there's always that sense of hope in there. And I kind of joke that this deck is like, it's kind of bitey. So it doesn't deliver messages. It doesn't deliver those hopeful messages in like a hug type of way, right? It's not nice about it. And if you know the character that I relate this deck to, like it totally makes sense. Like he's not nice about anything either. But the way that it delivers the truth is really what I'm tapping into. And even though it's not always warm and cozy and cushy and comforting, it's what you need to hear. So that's kind of how I work with this deck, even though it's like, it's a little bit difficult to work with sometimes in terms of it's very blunt and it can be kind of mean in how it gives you those sort of hopeful messages. Also physically, I kind of joke like it's physically like a boyfriend too, because like it's kind of stiff and difficult to work with and it doesn't really want to riffle and bridge. It will, but it doesn't really want to. Because it's that kind of stiff cardstock. It's kind of glossy. It kind of like sometimes it just kind of bites my hands, like especially when I'm trying to like riffle it. It kind of digs in a little bit. It kind of hurts. And yet that feels so fitting for that energy. Like truth hurts, right? Truth hurts, baby. And sometimes, you know, the light is not always light and fluffy and affirmational. And that's the thing I really like about this deck is for me, this deck is very much a deck that sits in kind of the same space in terms of giving you that hopeful message, that finding the light through the dark, but it doesn't do so in an affirmative type of way. It's kind of like the blunt side, the more real side of an affirmation oracle. And I really, really like that about it is that it is just kind of blunt and it's honest. Like it'll tell you where the hope is, where the light is. You can also look at the card images in terms of like where actual light and shadow is hitting on the card. That's a really cool aspect to play with this deck too. So this is the Notoria Tarot and Light. Again, I also have the Goetia. I use it almost just as much, but probably when we're talking about decks I've used the most so far this year, I've used this one more than that one, although they often come out together. So another deck that I've used a ton this year, and I think I used a lot toward the end of last year. In fact, I think I've used it just a ridiculous amount ever since I got it, and that is the Tabletop Tarot. As I've mentioned many times, and as Lisa mentioned in our WTF video, this is the Legends and Lattes deck. So the deck that is just like that book, but in deck form. This is my cozy deck. This is my comfort deck now. I have a couple of other decks that I realized that like probably need to be rehomed because they were kind of bought with that idea of them being kind of comfort cozy decks. And I don't ever use them because if I want that comfort cozy energy, this is the deck that I pull out. It is full of this cozy fantasy vibe, and it is just alive with characters that I know and recognize, and in a world that I love escaping to. So when I'm looking for comfort and support and I just want to feel that warm, cozy energy, like I don't go to the Notoria, I go to the tabletop. Because so many of these images are familiar to me, whether they are sort of, loosely inspired by actual characters that exist in other places, or it's just kind of this idea of this type of a character. They feel like characters and beings and worlds and fantasies that I have been a part of for decades. And there's a comfort there. There's a sense of, this is familiar to me. This is comforting. This is supportive. When I'm having a bad day, like one of my favorite things to do is go play a video game, right? When work gets to be too much, go jump into a game, whether it's a cozy game or whether it's even a killing all the bad guys in BG3, or it's drop into a fantasy book, right? A fantasy world or a fantasy TV show or movie. So much of my comfort watching, gaming, reading revolves around the fantasy genre. And it's been that way ever since I can remember. And so for me, this is a deck that kind of just represents that idea of that comfy, cozy, what I go to when I need comfort and support, when I feeling like I need the sort of hug vibes. I go to those kind of worlds. We joke that when I'm sick, one of my go-tos is Star Trek Next Generation. That's sci-fi, not really fantasy in this D&D world, but same kind of principle, right? I don't go to your typical sort of Hallmark Channel sort of shows if I'm feeling not well and I need comfort and support. I go to stuff like Star Trek, like Stargate, shows and books and places that exist in a world different than our own. And that's kind of where I like to be when I'm feeling in that space, when I need that comfort and that support, when things get rough, when I've had a bad day. This is just the ultimate hug deck for me, is really what it is. If I had to pick one deck in my collection that is my hug deck, it's this one, because it just represents everything that brings me comfort and joy. And when I do readings with this, when I pull out this deck, just the shuffling it, the using it. I mean, I have talked about shuffling, and because that is a part of the reading experience, I think it's a valid thing to add to the conversation. This deck is very easy to shuffle. It's got a great shuffle. It's easy, it's soft, it shuffles well, it's got, a beautiful aesthetic to it in terms of, the colors and the vibe and everything's really beautiful in this deck, but it's just such an easy deck to work with. It's based on the Rider-Waite-Smith, so you can definitely pull that in. So there's that familiarity there too. Even though we're looking at fantasy characters and D&D inspired worlds, it's still the Rider-Waite-Smith underneath it. And so there's that familiarity there, even though that's not my prime way of reading. That's not the way I was taught to read. I'm still extraordinarily familiar with it, and I still layer it into a lot of my work when it applies. And so I love that familiarity that I have there as well, because it's like an easy reader. It's just comforting and supportive and an easy read, and definitely one of my most used decks. I think from the end of last year, clear all throughout the first half of this year as well. So the last deck that I want to mention in kind of my top 5, again, weren't really in any particular order. This is the Tarot de Carlotydes, and I recently just mentioned this one in my May practice because it was one of the main decks that I worked with. Here's the beautiful backs, which I love. This deck is, again, another favorite in my collection. I do have an oracle that I could have mentioned. It's the Modern Nirvana. I almost always paired that deck with this one, and they work together beautifully. But I absolutely love everything about this deck, and I gushed about it in my monthly practice as well, about how well it works for me. It is this wonderful blend of kind of fantasy and pop culture, and it's a little bit more modern in places and a little bit more fantasy in others, and it's just this gorgeous little hybrid of kind of all the weird little things that I'm interested in, right? It kind of represents all the weird little facets of my world, because my world does kind of traverse from the mundane to the magical to the completely, you know, fantastical in terms of hobbies and interests, like games I play and books I read and things like that. So it kind of has this ability to traverse all of those realms for me. It kind of functions in a similar way as the Dreaming Way, as in I can throw this deck like anything at it and it does beautifully. I never struggle with the messages. It does have some Rider-Waite-Smith influence, but it's not really completely locked into it, which I love. It does some creative things with it. I love the aesthetics of it. I love the color palette. Like, it's just a beautiful deck. The suit of Pentacles is my favorite in this deck, and like that's my favorite suit anyways. So the fact that I love it in this deck like just makes it all the better. But there's just something about this deck, about the way that it really does traverse all of those different aspects of self for me. It's mundane, it's magical, it's fantastical. It hits all of those spaces all in one deck. And it does so in such a beautifully succinct way, even though it's kind of all over the place. Like, there's all these different references to all these different kinds of things, and yet it works so beautifully together. Also, again, talking about the way the decks work, this deck is slightly smaller than a tarot, and it is the perfect size for my teeny tiny hands. So this is my favorite deck to shuffle, because it is the perfect size. I wish all decks were 4-near size. And it's got a great, super flexible, super shuffleable cardstock. This is one of those decks that I could sit and comfortably shuffle this forever and never get tired, and it would be amazing. As you can see, it riffles and bridges beautifully. It's like in between traditional tarot size and pocket size. Sometimes even traditional tarot size, especially depending on the cardstock. If that's that cardboardy cardstock, then it can be difficult for me to work with. But sometimes a pocket deck is like too small. So this is like the perfect size, right in between. This deck makes me think of like the Three Little Bears, right? It's like some decks are too big and some decks are too small. And then there's this one that's just right. And I love it. This is my just right deck. Like, it's just right in terms of all the imagery. It's just right in terms of the influence. It's just right in terms of the size and the way that it shuffles. Like, it's amazing. It's definitely one of my favorites, and it's a go-to. I use it all the time. I don't always mention it in videos or show it on Instagram or whatever, but like, I do pull this one out all the time, particularly with the Oracle deck, and I do readings with it quite frequently. So it's definitely one of my top used tarot decks so far this year. Okay, let's move on to my 2 honorable mentions, because I just couldn't help myself. So my first honorable mention is my Eldritch Overload deck. This is an indie deck. I think I forgot to mention Tabletop is indie as well. So this was the deck that I mentioned that my character uses for combat in our gameplay. But I've also used it for a ton of readings, and I absolutely love this deck. It is everything that I probably shouldn't like in a deck. Not in terms of like the world or the art or anything like that. It is like D&D meets cyberpunk, and those are like 2 of my favorite genres. I absolutely love fantasy D&D stuff, but I also really love sci-fi cyberpunky, and this is this like most amazing, unique blend, which sets it apart from decks like my Tabletop or my Dungeons and Dragons Tarot or other decks that kind of sit in the same world. It has a totally different energy because it's like the blend of those 2 sort of genres together. I absolutely love working with it. It's super blingy. Like, I don't know if it'll pick up on camera, but there's so much bling on every card, but it is really tastefully done, and I don't mind it at all. In fact, I actually kind of like it because it feels like it really works with this deck. Like, the border is blingy, all the text is blingy, and then there's bling like all throughout. And normally when a deck has this much bling on it, I'm like not about it. It ends up going because I find it obnoxious. I find it intrusive on the artwork. There's a lot of those like cold foil stamping decks that is just so overdone that you can't even see the art anymore. It's like all the detail is lost. This deck is done bling perfectly, in my opinion. It's just the right amount. It's where it needs to be. Even though all the titles are blingy, they're all still very readable, which I definitely appreciate. I really like the artwork. And even though like this color palette, this like purpley pink neon, like it's very cyberpunky, so it's really cool. But it's not normally my aesthetic. Like, you know, the black and white and the green, that's my normal aesthetic. But I also really dig this art style too, and these colors, and it just brings a whole another type of energy to my table when I'm working with it. So of course, you know, I use it in the game, but also I've used it for readings. So yeah, this is a great one. I really enjoy working with it. Like this makes me think of Arcane. Like it just, so again, so many references that have personal tie-in for me as well. But it's a great one for anytime I'm trying to like make decisions. I use it a lot for that. Or if I just want to have fun, if I just want to pull out a fun deck to work with and get a fun reading and I want the color and the energy, like this is a great one for that because it always keys me into that sort of playful side of things as well. It's just beautiful. Talking about that Seven of Swords with the little goblin, love that. And talking about working with the deck, physically working with the deck, because that is important and I don't think we talk about that enough. This deck, although it is tarot size, so it's a little bit of a stretch for my hands, but not bad. This deck is, I don't know, it's just a joy to shuffle. Like, it is a little bit on the stiffer side, but for whatever reason, whatever this cardstock is, it's this like gorgeous kind of matte. It's also blingy on the back too, which again is usually not my favorite, but I love it in this deck. Sometimes when we're playing, I get like, we'll get distracted and I'll just like sit and shuffle my deck because like this deck is just such a joy to shuffle and work with. So different than the Notoria, which I tend to have on the table at the same time, because I'm, you know, playing those two characters. This deck is just a beautiful shuffle. I really enjoy it. I don't know that I could shuffle it forever like the Tarot de Carlotydes, but it is one that's a very comfortable shuffle. It shuffles beautifully. It doesn't stick. It riffles nice. It bridges nice. It's a great size. You know, it's just typical tarot size. It's not too thick, not too big, not sticky matte, like just beautiful. So tactilely, also another beautiful one that I enjoy working with. Okay, so my last deck and my last honorable mention is the Moon Power Tarot. Now I've put this one as an honorable mention mostly because it is newer in my collection. It's the newest one out of these, not my newest deck by far, but the newest one in this small collection of decks. Here's the beautiful backs. I do have the majority of the decks by this creator now. It is silver gilded, but like it's very nicely done. I don't mind it at all. I love this deck. For whatever reason, this deck just, it's kind of weird and funky. It does not really adhere to the Rider-Waite-Smith. It really does go its own way, and I really appreciate that about it. It's just one of those that is just kind of a little bit off center, and I feel like this deck really succinctly represents what goes on in my brain a lot of the time. Like there's some structure there, right? The structure is underneath the chaotic thought, but you just kind of got to sort through it all to get, like, I love this card. You got to sort through all of that to kind of get to what the big overarching message is. And like the art really isn't chaotic in the way that it like looks or anything. It's just an interesting depiction of the tarot. Gives me a different perspective when I'm working with this deck. And I just really, really love the art. I love the energy of it. I love that it's kind of slightly odd. It's not like, some of it's even kind of borders on the creepy, you know, like the face being pulled off. Maybe it's partially the black backgrounds and the moon energy, but it really feels like it represents what's going on inside my head really well. And it allows me to kind of take that energy, those chaotic thoughts and that energy of I don't know what to do with all of this that I'm trying to process right now. And it kind of gives me a way to focus that. And it gives it a pictorial language. I've been playing with the decks by this creator together with a particular oracle deck, and it's been really amazing. But that's a new thing that I've been doing, so definitely not a whole half-year thing. I feel like this deck, I've had it not the whole year, but for a good chunk of the first part of the year, but I've used it a lot. It's kind of just living at hand most of the time, and there's just something about it. I just really love it. It gets me. It's weird and it gets me, and like it doesn't always make sense in terms of when you're just like looking at a card, you're like, I'm not really sure what's going on there, but then you lay it down in a reading and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I see it. We have this thing with a group of friends where like, you know, your weird gets my weird, right? I can say weird things and you understand what I'm trying to get at, and you know, or do weird things or whatever, and this deck gets my weird. And I get it, and I love that. I guess that's what it is about it. Like, this deck gets my weird, and like I really appreciate that about it. So it's definitely one that I've been using a ton in over the last few months. So that is the Moon Power Tarot, my last honorable mention. All right, we're not gonna play the game. I'm trying to put all the decks on the table because it's just too many, but every video I try to play that game. Anyway, that is a look at my top 5 tarot decks at this halfway point through the year, which is a VR in response to Marine at Waves of Your Soul. I included 2 honorable mentions. If you have not seen Marine's video, I will definitely leave a link for it along with links for everything else I've shown here in this video in the description box below for you. Definitely go check her out. Go subscribe if you have not. She's one of my favorite channels and I absolutely love everything that she creates. So I was really excited to be able to do this as a VR and I hope more people do it. I would love to see more of these. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed this video and I look forward to hanging out with you again soon.